In this video, we're going to discuss the nature versus nurture argument for intelligence. We'll describe how the genetics and the environment both can affect intelligence, and the relationship between IQ scores and socioeconomic status. So do you know who this individual is? His name is Ben Carson, and he's a retired neurosurgeon who was the first doctor to successfully perform a hemispherectomy. This occurred back in the 1980s. So this hemispherectomy is surgery that removes half the brain, and this only occurs in very serious conditions where there is seizure-related activity that can't be controlled. In addition, you might recognize him for running for the Republican nomination against Trump in 2016, and then he went on to be his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. So you'd think he must be above average intelligence to do all of those things, you would think, right? It didn't always seem the case. So Ben Carson was born in South Detroit, and he started his life in a 700 square foot house. His mother learned that his father had a second family, and they divorced when Carson was 5. He then moved to Boston, where he attended a small Seventh-day Adventist school. At this time, his mother attempted suicide, and she was hospitalized for depression. At the age of 10, he moved back to Detroit with his mother and his brother. They moved into a primarily white neighborhood, and from then he attended primarily white schools. When he started back to school in Detroit, he was at least a year behind the other students due to the education he had received in Boston. By the time he was in high school, they had moved back into a predominantly black neighborhood, and he has reports of him having a violent temper and almost stabbing a friend and hitting his mom on the head with a hammer. However, he was in the 90th percentile for SAT scores, and he attended Yale. He could only apply to one school, so put all his eggs in one basket. Yale's not a bad basket to put your eggs into. He struggled his first year of medical school, but then he excelled in his second. So this seems like a very interesting story of nature versus nurture. So when we talk about nature versus nurture, we needed to define this term heritability, which I think we've had before and we'll have again in the future. But heritability is a statistical estimate of the proportion of total variance in a trait that can be attributed to genetic differences among individuals within a group. So to examine heritability, psychologists turn to adoption and twin studies. So identical twins are going to share 100% genetic similarity, where fraternal twins are no more than just a regular sibling. So showing 100% of genes shared, 50% of genes shared, half siblings would be 25% of genes shared. And so researchers look to these individuals, twins, adoption studies, siblings, etc. So this is showing you the percent in IQ correlation. We can see identical twins raised apart actually have a over 70% IQ correlation. Next, we have fraternal twins raised together, sharing 50% of their genes and sharing their environment. Although not shown here, children that are adopted, their scores correlate better with their biological parents than their adopted parents. Overall, we find heritability to be around 50% for intelligence for children in IQ, and about 60 to 80% in adults. So the idea is that in children, our intelligence or IQ is going to be about 50% related to genetics, but for some reason, as we turn into adults, or become adults, I should say, that increases. And one reason for that is the fact that children can't choose their environment, but as adults, we can pick our environment. And so perhaps the level of intelligence we have influences the environment we choose to find ourselves in. However, we also need to make sure that we don't assume that genetics plays a role in differences between groups. So the differences between groups, such as different races, tend to be more environmental than genetics. So let's briefly just talk about some environmental influences that could reduce mental ability. So remember, in children, while 50% of intelligence or IQ might be attributed to genetics, the other 50% is going to be environmental. So things like poor prenatal care, not getting the right nutrition for the mother, smoking, infections, drugs and alcohol, all of those can lead to learning disabilities and low IQ. The IQ gap between malnourished and well-nourished children can be 20 points. Lead can be very damaging to the developing nervous system. Often in the news you'll hear things about different toys being recalled because of lead paint or high lead content. And so exposure to toxins can also decrease levels of intelligence. Stressful family circumstances can also decrease IQ scores. In contrast to this, what could raise mental ability? A healthy, stimulating environment can go a long way in increasing intelligence. We've talked about the first 5 years being really important: talking, stimulation, enriched environment, informing those synaptic connections. Well, memory is important in intelligence. And we'll talk in the memory section a little bit about how neurogenesis is involved with the plasticity response into experiences and with learning and memory. So when I was an undergraduate, I actually worked on a project where we went out to low-income families and worked with the mother or a caregiver to help teach them how to effectively read and play games with their children to help improve their cognitive skills and scholastic achievement. So the idea here was simply that we were providing a stimulating and encouraging environment to the children, and that if we did this at a young age, again in those first 5 years, that it would translate into better cognitive outcomes later on. And they did see a little bit of that.